Spectrovision Radio.
Welcome to Gods, Ghosts, and UFOs, everyone. My name is Jordan, and this is the biggest podcast in the universe, where we talk about all the stuff they said wasn't real. Who's we? You may wonder? Well, that would be Tom and Mal. Say hi, my conventionally attractive friends with above-average intelligence.
Hello.
Hey, we're hot, smart people.
And also today we're joined by someone who is far, far more credentialed than any of us in a wide variety of domains. But before we let him speak, I need to give him a proper introduction. Nick Cook is a British aviation journalist and consciousness researcher. As aviation editor at Jane's Defense Weekly in the 90s, he won 4 Royal Aeronautical Society Journalism Awards before starting after fringe aerospace stories like a bloodhound. He wrote a book in 2001 called The Hunt for Zero Point, which covers a decade-long investigation into alleged Nazi anti-gravity research and its possible connections to the US. Just a casual weekend read. Then in 2014, Nick's wife had what she called a shared death experience and claimed she briefly glimpsed the meaning of life and the secret of the universe. From that point on, Nick turned his attention on consciousness studies. And because he has apparently never half-assed anything in his life, he entered Robert Bigelow's essay contest on post-death consciousness in 2020, and not only did he win the $20,000 prize, Bigelow asked Nick to come serve as the director of his Institute for Consciousness Studies. Nick, I swear I'm going to let you start talking in a second here, but first I need to properly set expectations for our listeners. Your base of knowledge, experience, and insight far outstretches our capacity to do it justice in one short episode of our enthusiastically silly show. Frankly, I'm both baffled and overjoyed that you agreed to come chat with us at all. But now that we have you, welcome.
Thank you, Jordan, and all of you. I think I'm in exactly the right company, actually, from your descriptions of yourselves. I'm going to fit in wonderfully.
Very good. That's our highest hope as well. And I'll probably emphasize this a few times today, but before we stop recording, if people are interested in anything we talk about today, they should go find you on Substack. Go read your books, go listen to your many other interviews that you've done. You are a rocket engine, and we're really grateful to have you. So, to kick things off, because it's top of mind, we just did an episode on this last week. I've watched The Age of Disclosure. I don't know if Tom and Mal have yet. I think that they're not quite as interested in it as I am. I'm just curious what your perspective on that is, because you have been deeply sort of enmeshed in that world. You know the players, you know the sort of conversations, you know the landscape. I would say you're not necessarily one of the people who's talking about this constantly. I think that you're doing more valuable research than that, but I am curious what your perspective is on that these days. I think just to sort of warm us up in the conversation, let's talk about current events, so to speak.
Well, of course, I couldn't wait to watch it, and I got a chance to watch it last weekend, and I thought it was fantastic. Now, I've seen criticisms all over the place saying, this is amongst the UFO, UAP community, going, oh, it didn't break anything new, it was old hat. There was nothing in there that, that we didn't already know about. I honestly think that entirely misses the point of the film, which is that it is breaking new ground in an accessible way, to my mind, for people who have either not come across this subject before, in part or in whole, or else were just frankly skeptical about it. And I have a sort of vested interest in it because I thought, you know what, I would really like to have a discussion with a skeptic about how they viewed the evidence in the film. Because, I'm a former defense journalist. I did that for 15 to 20 years. And I found the evidence in the movie pretty compelling. And I found it compelling on the strength of the witnesses. 34 witnesses from the Pentagon, from Capitol Hill, from administrations various, all saying this is real. Non-human intelligence is here. This isn't some amorphous kind of idea of things visiting us, from light years away. They are actually, there is a presence here on this planet. And all of these 34 witnesses are saying that. So I actually launched what I call the Age of Disclosure Challenge on Instagram, where I said, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to have a discussion with a skeptic friend of mine who wouldn't touch this subject with a barge pole. And and because I'm going to be really interested in how this individual or these individuals, I have several friends who are very skeptical on this subject, so how they are going to refute the evidence. And I genuinely want to have that conversation with them, because I hope it would be a conversation. Oh, then I invited followers on Instagram to do the same with their skeptical friends, or if they were skeptical, have the same discussion with a believer, so that you basically have this big conversation. We all get back together again and we share what we found. Well, interestingly, I had a lot of great comments on Instagram, but I've had no one yet out of hundreds, if not thousands, actually talk about the debate, the discussion, and how that debate and that discussion would unfold. And what I'm seriously beginning to wonder when we get confronted by big issues like this, and there's very little that's more divisive than this subject, is whether we have the ability anymore to hold these kinds of conversations in a very adult way. Because, of course, everything is so polarized online. It's like you're either full of shit if you talk about this stuff, or you're gullible, etc., etc. But we shouldn't be talking about any of those things. We should be talking about the very interesting evidence that was presented in that film, and then discussing whether it stands up in court. And that's what I wanted to do. That's what I still want to do. So to your question, Jordan, I found it a very interesting film. I didn't feel it was aimed at me, but that's not the point. It's aimed at a very wide audience out there. I mean, I note that it's already being talked about in the sort of the same breath as Oscar nominations for documentaries and such. So I really hope that it does its job, which to my mind is getting out there and presenting the evidence in the way that it did, in a very responsible, compelling way, to people who have not been confronted by this subject before.
We talk a lot about the idea of consilience on this show. That is to say that there is supporting data that can reinforce scientific findings. And when it comes to UFO or UAP phenomena, the consilient data that's always ignored is experiencer accounts. And it for close to 100 years has been largely dismissed as people who are crazy or hallucinating or saw Venus. Venus appears a lot in explanations. When you're talking about this documentary and you're saying the evidence presented, you're also still talking about experiencer evidence. Am I right? That is to say, no one came forth with here is, physical material from a craft. These are people who are established in the military and intelligence community saying, listen, I saw this, or I had direct experience with this, and they're saying that on camera. Am I right in that? I have yet to see the picture.
Well, what I thought distinguished the film was that there was very little in the way of revelatory background B-roll, film that showed new shots of UAP. They were all, standard archive shots, particularly of things like the Tic Tac and, the 2017 films that were released by Lou Elizondo and Chris Mellon. So the witnesses, per se, in the film were 34 people who were really talking about their assessment of the intelligence that they had been privy to.
Yes.
So there was or to my memory, very little subjective testimony from people who said, oh, I've seen this or I've seen that.
Okay.
It was more experts across the Pentagon and in the administration and on Capitol Hill who have been briefed on intelligence data at a very senior level. So some of them were, at the upper echelons of the intelligence community and the defense community, even if they were retired, saying, we've seen the data and this is real. Now, I spent, as I said, 15 plus years as a defense journalist. I routinely got to interview those kinds of people. And contrary to, the sort of gales of criticism that I've seen about the film from skeptics saying, oh, they're all lying, they're all making it up, It is far more complicated, in my experience as a defense reporter, journalist, to string together 34 pieces of testimony and align them in a conspiracy that says this is all made up, than it is actually to accept the evidence itself, which is not all of it,
That's right.
but at least some of it is real. And you only have to have some of it being real for this to be absolutely extraordinary, because it's talking about a non-human intelligence presence on this planet.
I think that's where you hit the wall, right? Where when you swim in these waters, proof becomes a moving target. There are some people who cannot be convinced, even by their own lying eyes. So, we all know that every phenomena, supernatural or not, exists on a spectrum of probability, right? There's never certainty. And so for you look at something like that and you go like, given my background and experience and what I know, this is sufficient for me. But there are other people, probably because of ontological shock, or they just don't want to open that door even a crack, where you say, oh, I want to debate a skeptic, that it doesn't matter what you show them. Do you get that? Do you have that feeling as well?
Definitely. What's fascinating about this is it becomes a discussion about worldviews, belief systems, and held beliefs. And it is incredibly hard, if you've been inculcated in a particular way of seeing things, to unsee it. And that's what you're dealing with here. I mean, it doesn't matter whether the subject is, UAPs or broader kind of government conspiracies. If that's the way you see the world, that this is all bullshit, your government is conditioned to lie to you, all of that, then it is very hard to unravel that. It is, not dissimilar to deprogramming someone who's been through a cult. And to that extent, we've all been kind of educated in a kind of quasi-cult-like way for at least, the early parts of our lives, because we're all absorbing secondhand the belief systems of people around us. And if those result in a particular worldview, and if in this case, your worldview is my reality is solid, the desk that I am leaning on right now is solid, and there is no way that these things, or, UAP or UFOs or things like them, can enter my reality space, because in my worldview, I hold no room for them. And that is hard to unpick. And I think that's what we're dealing with here. But it also then morphs into a discussion about paradigms, science paradigms and paradigm changes. And, we have to remind ourselves that certain paradigms shifted when outlier phenomena on the edges of the old paradigm could not be absorbed in that paradigm. And we had to break with form and go for a new paradigm. The great example is Einstein's space-time continuum and general relativity. What the evidence before that was just not fitting within the old paradigm. And that allowed for Einstein's theory of general relativity to come through, and is now, of course, along with quantum mechanics, the dominant paradigm. But right now, we are faced with more outlier phenomena that does not fit within the general relativity and quantum mechanical paradigm that we're in. And pretty soon we're going to have to deal with that, because the evidence is, I think, mounting and mounting and mounting, that this paradigm is not fit for purpose.
Well, I'm struck by so much that you're saying, Nick. This makes so much sense to me. I think there's something so assaulting about the information. You used the word confronting when you were talking about people may have not had to confront this in their lives. And I think that that's part of the issue. Often it feels almost like an identity problem or an ego problem too, that it's like, I see myself as a smart person and I feel like I would have to undo all of my identity work in order to be able to confront this, to like let this in. I'd have to assume that I was ignorant before, and I don't know if I'm comfortable with that, especially people who consider themselves to be scientists or to consider themselves to be intellectuals. It seems like it's even more challenging. So I'm excited to see the film based on what you're saying, because it does seem like I don't think we're going to get here by like throwing everybody into like the hot water. We have to figure out how to like slowly turn it up together and walk into the water together. And how do you do this? Like, how do you do this in your life with people in your life? How do you talk to, I mean, because you are clearly a deep well. I wish we could talk for 7 weeks, but like, how
Got time.
how do
1 hour
you
at a time.
We would
how
provide
do
the
you
meals.
talk to someone at a dinner party? You know, like how do you? What's your
cautiously.
approach here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Very
Approach with caution.
Nick goes down to the pub every week and just collar somebody. Listen.
Before you answer Mallory's question, this thing keeps pinging me, is that what you related about your experience on Instagram. And it occurs to me that social media is an identity reinforcer. So it's
Sure.
probably the last place that you could go to have like the kinds of conversations that would actually move the needle on people's opinions. Because social media has just been so overclocked, overtuned. It's been so calibrated to evoke outrage, to pit us against each other, to reinforce our existing beliefs. Like, it does not challenge paradigms. It's like not what it's designed to do. And so I think that in any way we can have these conversations, we have to not expect them to happen in like social media contexts.
Quite. And that's the value of a film, of this film, but it's the value of any long form piece of, let's call it entertainment, is that, you know, this stretches across an hour and 50 minutes. And it challenges you to stay with it over that hour and 50 minutes. This is not, you know, soundbite data here. And that's so true, Jordan, as you said, and as I said earlier, that social media is so polarizing, it's so divisive, it's so black and white that everyone, I think, you know, they want their data in these bite-sized packages. This, and getting back to you, Mallory, this does not fit in this bracket. People talk about disclosure. You know, the film talks about disclosure. Disclosure is coming by turning the volume knob up very slowly.
Yeah.
It is coming, you know, mixing my metaphors, by boiling the frog slowly. It's not coming overnight. And when people ask me about disclosure, I say, look, it's already happening. It's been happening for a long time. It's been happening sort of exponentially. I mean, given that this in the modern era is an 80-year phenomenon, since 2017, when the New York Times, you know, had the story which brought all of this to the fore, that the Pentagon had a secret unit that had been studying UFOs. That revelation was in 2017, and you know, a lot has happened since then. But it's been incremental rather than it being an overnight thing. And I think precisely for that reason, which is our belief systems get cast, as you said, into a form of identity that we then, of course, carry around as identifying to us. And as you said, it becomes challenging to everything about you, or it can do, because, you know, egos being what they are, it is shattering to have to confront evidence that says, bloody hell, you know, I might just have got my entire worldview and the world wrong over the X, Y, and Z years of my life. That is not a comfortable thing. I confronted a lot of that stuff 20 some years ago, and it's not comfortable. It's deeply uncomfortable. But if you're open-minded and you're curious, that can be an interesting journey. But you've got to allow the curiosity bit in. And sadly, so few of us these days do that.
Can I ask you, if you're not going to anchor your identity in a belief system, then, and I think that you're the right person to ask this question too, because you've done a lot of a lot of very deep research, and I think you've made a lot of progress in trying to unpack what consciousness is, which is on some level a question about what we are deep down, what drives us, what sort of composes our experiences. If you're not going to root your identity in beliefs or a belief system or a paradigm, and which I think is important if you want to be open, if you want to sort of be curious, what could you root your identity in?
Well, I'm not sure I'm going to answer this question adequately, but I think where I've been incredibly fortunate is to have had various segments in my career which have exposed me to new ideas. I started off, as you mentioned, as a defense journalist. That exposed me deeply to the world of technology, secrecy, and in its final guise, ultra secrecy. I spent a great deal of time investigating secret programs. That was part of my job. So I knew about that culture. So that enabled me to break down some mini paradigms there when I was sort of able to knock down these siloed walls that, secret programs build around themselves. So that was one early exposure to the idea that secrets can be held for a very long time, contrary to another criticism that's out there, which is you can't keep something secret for 40, 50, 60 years. Oh, yes, you can. I've been privy to covering those defense programs where they are held in deep secrecy for decades and decades. So that was point one. The second, through the writing of this book that I did, The Hunt for Zero Point, which was very heretical by the standards of my career. At the time that I wrote it, I was a senior defense journalist. I was lunching in aerospace companies, on both sides of the Atlantic at the time, getting information. And it was deeply not a great idea to expose to these people that you were interested in top secret breakthrough propulsion technologies that might result in craft that looked like UFOs. If I'd mentioned that when I was investigating it, I would have been out in my ear. I mean,
not exactly a door opener.
Magazine. Yeah, exactly. Let alone by the industry. So, I had to play all of those cards close to my chest. In the latter stages of researching that book, I was introduced to, some people who feature in the Age of Disclosure, like Hal Puthoff, who's, covered a multiplicity of sort of heretical scientific areas like UFO, propulsion technology, like the nature of reality, and like remote viewing, psychic spying. And I remember when I went to see him, first of all, this was probably in the late 1990s, thinking I was going to talk to him about advanced space propulsion. But I ended up having a discussion with him about remote viewing, which he'd also been involved in. In fact, he was one of the founders of the remote viewing program. And this was deeply challenging to me, talking about worldviews and paradigms. This is like, well, hang on a second. So you're a space propulsion expert, but you're also one of the founders of the CIA's psychic spying program. How does that work? So I had to deal with that then, but slowly acclimatized myself to the idea that, there are, quotes, weird programs out there that serious people like Hal Puthoff are involved in. So maybe I should pay a bit more attention to them than simply dismissing them out of hand. So that was sort of my second phase of acclimatization. And then the third was deeply shattering to somebody who kind of thinks they've got some of it figured out, which I thought I had, which was my wife's shared death experience, which you mentioned in the introduction. So in 2014, we were gathered at a very sad occasion where my mother-in-law is dying. I'm in the room. My wife is holding her mother's hand. And at the precise moment that she dies, my wife stands up and goes, "She's all right. Everything's fine." I'm looking at her thinking, it's not fine. Your mother, whom you love deeply, has just died. What's going on here? That resulted in she telling me what she'd experienced was this. It was effectively a near-death experience, but turned out to be something called a shared death experience, which I had never heard of, but which turned out to be a thing. Thousands of people have had shared death experiences. That made me go off and investigate that, which got me into the consciousness thing. I researched that deeply, fortunately at a time when nothing much else was going on, because it was sort of during lockdown and the pandemic. And then, as you said in your intro, I entered the Bigelow Institute of Consciousness Studies essay competition on the survival of consciousness post-death. And thanks to all the research I'd done, I won a prize. And then Mr. Bigelow asked whether I would be, small correction, it wasn't the head of that research, but it was one of a research panel who he'd set up to investigate consciousness. So
got it.
Thanks to sort of that spectrum of challenging things in my career, not all of which I feel in retrospect I was in control of. In other words, some of it weirdly felt, I hesitate to say meant, because that sounds very...
No, you're in good
you're
company.
In the right place.
Yeah, we're good.
Yeah.
We're good.
Okay.
You've come to the right place.
Yeah.
Thank God for that. So it felt sort of like I wasn't wholly in control of, all of the things all of those doors opening. And so bit by bit, my belief systems were confronted, and bit by bit, I allowed myself to get back to your point, Mallory, about, the slow acclimatization of all of this. It allowed me to be where I am now, which is open-minded, but still skeptical. I need to kick the tires of all the things I'm being told and shown, in the same way I was when I was chasing down stealth fighters in the 1980s and 90s.
This leads me to the topic that I've been dying to talk to you about as part of our 7-week program. And to do that, I'll set the stage. Right after we signed or launched with SpectraVision, the three of us found ourselves doing a panel discussion in Los Angeles with some of our sister podcast hosts, one of whom is Danny Sheehan. And the question was, what are they? If you make it to the pearly gates and you get to ask one question, what are these NHI? And Danny Sheehan starts off, and he just, here are the 5 morphologies of, alien creatures and all this stuff. And he's an extraordinarily accomplished person. I had no answer myself, and it kept slowly coming to me. And when it did, I started babbling about the Chandogya Upanishad, because what I wanted to talk about was the idea of consciousness as the ground of all being. And when you read that Upanishad, consciousness, or Brahman, is described as self, as the most subtle of all things. And then the lesson is, thou art that. You are that self. And so whatever can be said, about what we call NHI, or even trees and houses around us, that is us, right? That's where I wanted to start. Because when you think about disclosure, right, you're thinking about a hierarchical structure of governmental or non-governmental entities that are, steeped in secrecy and, intelligence. And you're thinking about receiving something as a passive consumer, when in fact, this kind of knowledge or experience is available to all of us, as I'm sure you gleaned from Hal Puthoff when he's talking about remote viewing, which is available to everyone. And so for my own sake and for our listeners, I try to reorient their thinking from the vertical to the horizontal. And when I heard that you had been studying consciousness as a part of this process for you, as a guy who is so well established and credentialed in a very, very different sort of world, I very much want to hear your thoughts about it and how it relates to the phenomenon that we're talking about.
Great question, and I'll take it from the top. So normally I take some time to get here, but I probably need now to perhaps answer your question, I hope, by saying where I am now in all of this. And where I am now is I'm looking very much at simulation theory as to the nature of reality. and perhaps I'll backtrack a fraction, which is, what's the big secret behind disclosure? What is disclosure really covering up? Well, disclosure in the frame that we've discussed it today is about UFOs and UAP. But, as a number of people have said, I do think we're getting to the point pretty soon where, as a species, we can handle the information that we're not alone. I think less easy to handle are all the corollaries that spin out of that. The big one of which, it's sort of where the train stops, is, well, reality, I'm sorry, folks, is not what actually we cracked. Or, we've all been educated reality to have been through, our schooling and education. It is actually quite different from what we were told. And I think that is an unsettling notion. Funnily enough, it doesn't unsettle me where I am now, but I've had plenty of time to acclimatize to it. So where I am is simulation theory. And the reason for that is for the reasons we've been discussing earlier, which is I've been looking at outlier phenomena. And I'm not just talking about UAPs here, but things like ESP, and things like near-death experiences, shared death experiences, all of these things that fall into a paranormal bucket. But we can't dismiss these things. They're not the hallucinations of individuals. They are a data set, a clear data set that is common to a great many people. So we need to take them seriously, and they don't fit within the present paradigm. So what do we do with them? Now, it just happened that I was at the recent Seoul convention, the institute set up by Gary Nolan to study UAP phenomena and illicit disclosure, amongst other things. And at Seoul, I met a guy called Rizwan Rizverk, who is big on simulation theory.
He was on the stage with us.
He was on stage with us and talked
fantastic.
about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Riz is great. We had a really interesting conversation. I was fortunate in that he'd read The Hunt for Zero Point, so he sort of knew my sort of trajectory. And I was very interested in his simulation hypothesis because I'd already reached that conclusion. And we both come to the same point, that we are living in a simulation from two very different points of the compass. His was from a gaming perspective. Riz is or was a gaming entrepreneur. He'd set up X number of companies that had done extremely well out of gaming, and he understood that world. I understood the world of defense and aerospace, and latterly had moved into this consciousness space where I was seeing outliers that did not fit within a framework, this scientific framework. And the only way that I could rationalize the appearance of those outliers in our reality scape at the moment was through this idea that reality is not how it is presented as a material reality to us, that consciousness, of course, is the founding principle and is, if you like, the software that drives the simulation. And we are presented, another great hero of mine who's allowed me to develop these ideas is a guy called Donald Hoffman, who presents the idea that, our reality is much like the desktop. We experience reality much like I experience or am able to navigate my computer via my desktop, which has icons on it. And the icons that I click on allow me to do all the things that I need to do on my computer. The icons I engage with on this perception of reality, this reality screen, allow me to navigate the material reality that is our current reality scape. But appearing on that screen of perception are these rogue icons, which is what I call my Substack, because these rogue icons are, as I said earlier, they're not subjectively unique. They are common to many, 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 many people. But the founding principle, the sort of the substrate that allows me to concoct a vision of reality that accommodates all of these phenomena is a simulation hypothesis, as I say, whose software is consciousness, but perhaps whose hardware is information. This is what I think our universe is composed of, is bits of information that arise into this simulation as the experience that we have. And of course, we are only experiencing a very small segment of the deeper reality, which is composed of, an infinite sea of information that would simply blow our brains if we tried to tackle it through our material tools that we have, the brain and the nervous system being the prime components. So what do? We filter that out to give us only the reality that we need for our survival. And there I'm borrowing heavily off Donald Hoffman, who that's his thesis.
I think often about the fact that the vast majority of humanity lives on this very, very, very thin membrane on the sort of surface of the earth, that below us is this, unfathomable depth of water and rock and caverns that we just don't know. And as deep as we go, we keep finding new bacterial life. And it's just like that quote unquote reality reaches far, far below our feet. And then, of course, you can go the other direction and it's, reality goes sort of infinitely upward as well. And we sort of exist on this almost two-dimensional plane between the sort of depths and the heights of everything beyond. And it to me feels like a pretty good metaphor for the material reality that we can interact with across those domains, which is, I think, probably a fairly thin skin or membrane between, the full stack of whatever reality is. And that seems to be a pretty good metaphor for trying to comprehend why there might be, as you say, rogue icons, things that sort of penetrate our membrane of perception from outside of it, or that typically are outside of it. And then people within our human family whose perceptions are a little broader than most of ours are and can see far beyond, the membrane that we inhabit most of the time. But then the other thing that occurs to me is, I've brought this back up a couple of times because I thought it was so funny when Tom said it the first time, but we were talking about time and how time might not be sort of strictly real in the way that we think of reality, that time is this way that we organize our perceptions rather than being sort of some fundamental law of nature. And Tom said, well, it's not going to be very helpful to say time isn't real if you're being hunted by a tiger. You've sort of got to respect the constraints of your life. And I think that that's really important too, because one of the things that's always annoyed me since I was pretty young is this tendency of materialist nihilism to say, well, because everything's going to sort of go up in a puff of heat, what's even the point of anything, to sort of just like abdicate, all meaning to the wash of infinity. And it seems like a very silly approach to me. Why dismiss the meaning of the substance of our lives? You can do both things. You can say that the narrow band of reality that we inhabit is deeply meaningful and is vitally important, while also acknowledging that it's not everything, that it is not the totality of all existence.
Yeah, and that raises a very important point about meaning and a meaningful existence, because I've asked myself that question many times. Is there any point to this? And actually, if you talk about simulation theory, it sounds like there isn't, because you're just, I'm trivializing a vast, infinite creation by calling it a simulation. It's a poor word. In fact, it's a terrible word, and it doesn't do justice to what I actually believe the system is, which is an infinite, self-learning, evolving system that is programmed to test itself, to learn from itself. So it is godlike in this respect. It needs to understand what it has created by interrogating all of its nodes of existence, which actually makes existence very meaningful, because it means that I am a data point, I'm a data node, and I am feeding my experience as a co-creator of this system back into the system. Why am I a co-creator? Because actually, Nick, everything is an avatar of consciousness. It is not, we've already been over the materialist consciousness divide. If everything arises out of consciousness, materialism is just a convenient shell. And I, Nick, am an avatar within that shellscape. But my conscious self is a co-creator with the source of the creation. And I also think that the creator, in his or her infinite wisdom, might not have known all the parameters of the game. So that actually, particularly when when I look at the phenomenal creativity of which we as a species are capable, whether that's in the music sphere or the writing sphere or the artistic sphere or just building an incredible thing like the internet, that is phenomenally creative. Could the creator have game played all of those things at the beginning? I don't know. But I think it's worth asking the question that perhaps he or she didn't. And co-creatively, we are feeding extraordinary data back into the system, which is helping the system to understand itself and evolve and grow. And I think that's, if you were to make the analogy with a powerful self-learning AI, that's what we're in. We're in an artificial intelligence system that needs to grow all the time, which actually raises quite an interesting question about UAPs and UFOs. Why are UFOs and UAPs drawn to entropic things like battlefields and nuclear weapon systems? Entropy, as we all know, being the capacity of a system to slip towards chaos. Well, you could conjecture possibly that UAP are kind of repair bots in the system that appear over these places, near these places of high entropic value, to act as repair systems in the computation. And that is an idea I'm sort of working on at the moment, that this is what UAP, amongst other paranormal phenomena, are. They are sent to us to get us curious, to engage our creativity, our consciousness in its fuller capacity and capacities, to co-create in repairing the system when it falls into entropy, when the computation slows down too far. And it's not fully formed, it's early stage. I expect to have lots of people come back at me and kick the tires of it and go,
and they should do. But what a wonderful hypothesis, right?
And they should.
What
Absolutely
a wonderful hypothesis.
Right.
One of the things that we understand, that we take for granted on this program, is that the nature of high strangeness, supernatural phenomena, whatever you want to call it, whatever that closet or bin is that it is co-creative. And with respect to UFOs, we've talked about, Woody Derringer, seeing a UFO that looked like a stove, and it had a squeaky door, like an old Ford Rambler, in the 1960s. That was his experience, or the way that people describe a lot of UFO phenomena in the 50s and 60s. They looked like TV dinner trays, because that was sort of the aesthetic that the witness, or that not witness, because it's not a passive role, that co-creator understood. So the phenomena changes with us with respect to our understanding of the phenomena. When we start labeling things NHI or UFOs or poltergeist or whatever it is, and we start giving it a name, we are able to some extent to describe it, but we are also, by the same token, limiting it and separating it from where it naturally belongs. I understand that is what you're talking about. My question to you is it your belief that consciousness is non-local, does not grow from sort of the individual's wiring, but rather, like as I said earlier, is the ground of all being, that you, Nick, me, Tom, Jordan is an expression, a node of the Brahman, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, that's precisely what I think. And therefore, to get back to that earlier point, which I didn't quite finish, which is about meaning. I mean, on one level, you could dismiss this, quote, simulation as meaningless. But I don't, as I said, I don't see it that way. Actually, my input into the system, everyone's input into the system, everything's input into the system, whether you are a, quotes, conscious entity or an inanimate entity, you are feeding information back into the system all the time, which makes what each and every one of us does incredibly significant and important. It couldn't be more important. And everyone is being that, and everything is being that node all of the time. So my data points, my life suddenly becomes incredibly meaningful, even if I don't have a religious underpinning to kind of undergird it. It still leaves room for religion, but even in an agnostic sense, you can say that your life is incredibly meaningful because you are plowing data, rich, valuable data back into the system. I'm sorry, I didn't answer your question, Tom.
No, who cares? I love that. You answer my question by saying yes. Well, when you think like that, or when you come to that realization, rather, you have to let go of any sort of like human ideas of hierarchy. This is the thing. Once you put your arms around this idea, then you are by default no greater or lesser than any of your fellow beings. And all of a sudden, a lot of the ways in which we treat each other culturally and societally, governmentally, starts to become the sort of as grotesque as it actually is. In my own opinion, the great secret of disclosure is not that there are NHIs or whatever extraordinary, technology or whatever you want to say. It's just how shitty the U.S. government has been over the last 80 years with this Cold War mentality of weaponizing stuff like this, weaponizing this kind of technology and intelligence. And I'd rather hear Mal speak so I'm going to step off my soapbox and...
I'm so sorry that my internet timed out completely, and you're in the middle of what I know I'm going to need to go back and listen to. So if I'm asking a question that you've already answered, by all means, let me know, boys. But could you talk a bit about free will? Like, can we talk about free will?
Yeah.
I know, is that just
oh
a
my
nightmare?
God, yes.
I'm going to be really mean. I'm going to be really, really mean. And I'm going to say, we're actually going to end the episode right now. And all on that question, because not only do I want Nick to talk to us about his thoughts about free will, but I also want to push back on the sort of intrinsic meaning behind sort of data collection. That's an unfair flattening of your statements, Nick. I'm just trying to, summarize. But basically, I would love to dig into the bones and talk about morality a little bit. But I'll probably say some things that I don't necessarily want on our free feed. So,
so put a quarter in, kids.
Thanks to your timely intervention here, Jordan, this is going to enable me to Google up what I think about free will.
Very good. Very good.
Thank you. This is giving me some space to...
Nick, can we plan on having you back at some point too?
Also, please.
I've really enjoyed the conversation thus far.
And Nick, I just have to say, I feel like I'm in the middle of my confronting. The boys know this. I'm like constantly like, I feel like spaghetti, like loose spaghetti all the time. It's really exhausting. And I have found just in the interviews I've listened to yours, your approach to simulation theory is probably the most grounding approach I've found so far. It helps me wrap my head around what seems to be emerging for me as an idea that I can't walk away from, that makes a lot of sense, but I find horrifying a lot of the time. And so thank you for your perspective. And yeah, I think honestly for your humanness on the subject. I loved what Jordan was saying earlier about like, can this not also be meaningful? And I feel like you're very good about articulating that.
Well, thank you. And it's just important to stress that it is really meaningful. In fact, it doubles down on meaningful, even though, but the headline, as I said earlier, simulation theory negates that. It tends to conjure up an idea that it's not meaningful because it's like a game. It's not a game. It's just that, God, if someone can come up with the right name for simulation theory,
right?
That's what we need.
I have a suggestion, but we'll wait till the bonus episode. Couple of quick reminders before you go. First off, if you haven't left a rating on your platform of choice, please do that. One of the first things people look at when they're judging a show by its cover is the number of ratings it has. So if you dig what we're doing, show it with stars. In today's epilogue, we talk to Nick about free will as a feature of co-creation, what makes Earth School so glorious and terrible, and how Belgium's unexplained drone shutdown reveals how much intelligence agencies know, or don't. If you want to hear it, go to godsghostsufos.com or find the link in the description. See you next week, friends.